Oh man, today. I am so excited for today's build. In fact, I've been saving it specifically for this month, Macintosh, which is a month-long celebration of all things classic Macintosh. It's the culmination of a project that I started collecting parts for like 15 years ago, when I first learned about the Color Classics fabled Mystic upgrade. Well, today, after all these years, we're finally going to build that mythical Mac. But this isn't going to be just any Mystic. No, we're going to build the absolute most powerful Mystic possible. Almost. A nearly impossible PowerPC Mystic. Teenage me would have probably exploded. So stay tuned. And if you enjoy fulfilling your deepest, beigest computing fantasies, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel. We do a lot of vintage computer shenanigans around here, and it's definitely worth sticking around. So this is the Macintosh Color Classic. It's a pretty well-loved and relatively hard to find machine these days. I recently lucked into this pretty nice looking example locally, and I've been hunting for one for years. If you missed the video where we cleaned this thing up and restored it, check that out right here. We go fairly deep into the history and the specs of this machine, but as a recap, it was released in 1993 as the last of the original all-in-one compact Macs. In theory, it was the Mac that everybody had been waiting for. The classic compact form factor, but dropping that black and white display for a beautiful 10-inch color Trinitron. However, nearly everything inside this machine was a disappointment. It was glacially slow for the time. It had a 16 MHz 68030 processor with a hard RAM limit of just 10 megabytes. To put that into perspective, 1989's SE30 also had a 16 MHz 68030. And with the ROM upgrade, that thing could support 128 megs of RAM. Apple tried to fix the shortcomings of this machine by releasing the Color Classic 2 with a twice as fast 68030 and a system bus that could actually keep up with it. But the line was already tainted. Apple only released that machine in Canada and Japan, and then canceled the upcoming Color Classic 3 in favor of larger machines like the LC575. Speaking of the Color Classic 3, Apple got quite far in development before that project was scrapped. Internally named Mystic, the Color Classic 3 would share a motherboard with 1994's LC575, a reasonably fast 68 LCO40 machine that officially took up to 36 megs of RAM, and unofficially 128 megs. But thanks to Apple's component modularity back in the 90s, all you need to do today to make a Color Classic or a Classic 2 into a Classic 3 is take the motherboard out of an LC or Performa 575 and it slots right into the back of this machine. It's completely pin compatible and it's sized for the chassis and the slots and guides of this case. You do have to make a few easy board level modifications or macOS hacks to get the board to work correctly with the 10-inch Trinitron here, which has kind of a funky resolution. But we'll get to that in a bit, because we have to talk about the most exciting part. We're not just building any old Mystic with a 68040. This thing is going to be a PowerPC Mystic. And before I tell you all about just how that's possible, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay. PCBWay has long been a go-to source for quality PCBs and PCB prototyping. With low pricing, high quality, and turnarounds as fast as 24 hours, PCBWay.com is a one-stop shop for PCBs and PCB assembly. They offer SMT and through-hole assembly, wave soldering for PCBA, along with functional testing and even rapid turnaround IC programming services, which all combined can give you a working project right to your doorstep. So check out PCBWay.com today. It'll really help the channel grow. Link in the description below. So this big beautiful beast is my LC575. I recently rescued this thing from sitting in my mother's basement for the last 15 years. I originally found it in a thrift shop, which kicked off my quest to build a Mystic Color Classic, after reading about it on forums like the 68K MLA. Unfortunately, in my teenage exuberance, I took the motherboard out of this thing, and apparently my mom's basement ate it. But then, very fortunately, a viewer of this channel offered me this. It's an LC575 motherboard with the extremely hard to find PowerPC upgrade, which is doubly cool, literally, because you can switch back and forth between the 68040 processor and the PowerPC processor. And this is the only way to get a PowerPC processor into the Color Classic without doing the destructive Tacky mod, which involves dremeling out the insides of the case and shoving in an even faster PowerPC motherboard. These Color Classics are getting to be quite rare and quite brittle, so I'm not willing to take that kind of a risk with a Dremel, despite how incredibly cool the Tacky mod is. So this upgrade is going to make for a really fast, and importantly, totally reversible PPC Mystic. Oh, and if you're doing your own Mystic upgrade, check out the excellent guides from Brankus Creations and JDW. I'll link them up in the cards right here and down in the description too. They both cover the process really well, so we're just going to go ahead and do the swap. Well, before we do the upgrade, I do want to take some benchmarks so we can see just what kind of incredible difference the Mystic upgrade makes over a stock Color Classic. So I have MacBench 4.0 here, and we did run into a bit of a problem when we tried this before. Last time we tried to launch this, it wouldn't launch because it was complaining about not enough RAM. So I actually have as few things running as possible, including taking out the control strip. And yeah, we have just enough RAM. We could launch it with less RAM, but I figure we'll just give this Color Classic as big of a fighting shot as possible. And I'm going to make a new test suite here with just the stuff that should change. And let's run it. Okay, test complete, and the results are hilarious. Compared to the baseline Power Macintosh 6160, the processor on this Color Classic scored a mere 4%. And the floating point, well, there's no FPU in this thing, so that scored a 1. So yeah, the only place we have to go here is up. So unlike today Apple, 90s Apple put a lot of thought and effort into making their machines easy to disassemble and upgrade. The back of the Color Classic comes right off. Mine's missing the 2 screws here. And the motherboard, believe it or not, just slides out. So looking at the 2 boards side by side, you can tell they're really similar. This guy here is the Color Classic, and this is the LC575. I'll just take off the Ethernet card here. And the most important thing is that the connectors are identical. The Color Classic 3 was most likely going to have this motherboard with little to no change, except maybe a tweak to work with the super weird resolution on the Color Classic. But they're completely pin compatible, and that's so cool and convenient. And here is that PowerPC upgrade card. It's just so cool. This is the 66 megahertz version, marketed and branded by Apple, although I think this is still manufactured by Daystar Technologies. There was a 100 megahertz version of this card, but I am lucky enough to have this super rare thing here, so no complaints from me. And it's pretty interesting that you take the 68040 off of the LC575's motherboard and you stick it onto the upgrade card and it passes through, so you can choose whether you want to use the 68K processor or the PowerPC processor depending on the software that you're using at any given time. Super cool. And then all we have to do to install this literally is just slide it right in the back of the machine and everything just lines up. Except, actually it turns out, look, this RAM stick I have, which is 128 megs, is too tall to clear this little screw holder here, I'm gonna have to lay the RAM stick on its side, and then it will clear. Then once it's inside, I can snap it back up into place. Okay, so the board is installed and the RAM stick is snapped back into place. But we have another very silly issue. The original backplate, the ports don't line up to the holes in the plate. Fortunately, there's a solution. Joe from Joe's Computer Museum very graciously 3D printed me this new backplate which lines up to the ports on the 575's board perfectly. Wow, look at that. That's great. I think I'll probably paint this in a beige to match this case after I retrobrite it. But yeah, that fits perfectly. We'll just have to screw that into place. Okay, so I have it back together with the LC575 board installed with the PowerPC upgrade. Now it's probably not going to boot properly because the LC575 motherboard has no idea what to do with this Color Classics sub 640 by 480 resolution. But let's boot it up anyway and just see what happens, because I've never had a Mystic before. It chimes, that's a good sign. Oh, well that's interesting. It actually made it pretty far into the boot process using the Color Classics weird resolution before we got this system error, bus error. And it says try without extensions, so what the heck? Let's try it without extensions. Hold down Shift. macOS, oh nope, bus error again. Yeah, very interesting. I don't know what I expected it to do. I thought we'd have some weird stuff on the screen or something, but evidently it does start the boot process with the LC575 board in there. It just won't actually boot into macOS. So there's actually 3 ways that we can solve this issue. The first way is completely non-destructive. We can modify macOS itself, the system file, to allow it to boot up with this weird resolution. The second option would be to actually modify the LC575 logic board. You can jump a couple connections and actually make it natively support this 512 by 384 resolution. But we're going to take the third option. We're going to do the analog board modification known as the VGA mod, which will allow us to have 640 by 480. And it's going to be a little bit small on this already tiny 10-inch Trinitron, but it's going to be well worth it because that'll make sure that pretty much any software we throw at it will run on this now super fast machine. The only issue with that mod is it's going to make the original logic board not compatible with the analog board unless we reverse the modifications, which is possible, but it's kind of a pain. But that's okay because I intend on leaving this machine as a Mystic. And this logic board is going to have a brand new home, which if you watch other tech YouTube, you may just see this thing again. So don't worry, it's not going to waste. It's going to live on. You. So I'm going to be following along to Bruce's lovely walkthrough, and definitely I can recommend this to you, but we're going to be making a few modifications to the analog board. Namely, we need to isolate this pin here from this ground plane, and then we need to make a couple jumps of pins on the board. But it's pretty easy to do. Now in Bruce's video, he used a Dremel with a big bit and nerves of steel to get around here, but I just so happen to have this super cheap engraving pen, which I usually use to draw silly crap on my crap. But this should be perfect to take out this copper backplane around this pin. Okay, I've made all of the bodges that I need to bodge and all the cuts I need to cut. And according to my multimeter, everything should be connected correctly. Let's toss this back into Color Classic and see if it works. All right, we are back together and I am quite nervous. Let's flip this power switch. All right. Sounded like it initialized correctly. I heard the CRT. Let's hit the power button. Chime. All right, we have some off-center picture, but that's definitely 640 by 480. Check that out. It's alive. Time to pull out the plastic alignment tools here. Look at it. Look at the glorious 640 by 480. And yes, I know it's a little messed up on the geometry of the screen, but I'll tweak that later. I did order a bunch of capacitors to recap the analog board. I just haven't done it yet. So hopefully that and maybe some tweaking with the knobs on the tube will fix this weird little indent here. But still, look, it works. It's alive. 640 by 480. And not only that, but I put the SD card from the LC575 in here with macOS 8.1, and it works. Look, 132 megabytes of RAM, so the 128 stick plus the RAM that's on the motherboard, macOS 8.1, and even better, we already have the control panel for the processor upgrade, and we can restart this thing as a Power PC. And guess what we're going to do right now? Oh yes. There was the Power PC chime, which is different than the 68K chime. Mac OS, here we go. And there we go, we have it. Let's open our Apple System Profiler just to confirm. There we go. PowerPC 601 at 66 megahertz in our Color Classic. This is a Mystic PowerPC Color Classic, which I have never seen before. And we didn't have to do any crazy dremeling to the case or anything. It's a slide-in upgrade and a couple tweaks to the analog board. And here it is. PowerPC Mystic. It's so cool. Okay, I'm going to run some quick benchmarks. I'm going to benchmark the 68040 and the PowerPC processor, which, yes, I know, in the LC575 video that I did ages ago, I said I was going to do that in the next video then. So we're doing it now, and we're doing it inside of a Color Classic. This is so cool. Oh, just look at these scores. I ran the PowerPC card and the stock 040 through the MacBench processor benchmarks and FPU benchmarks. And the baseline system is the 6160 Power Macintosh, which is a PowerPC 60 megahertz. And remember, the stock Color Classic was so slow, it almost didn't even register on the benchmarks. It scored a 4% in the processor score against that 6100 and a 1% on the floating point because the 030 didn't have a FPU. So the 68LC040 scored 35%, which is a huge improvement over the 4% score. And it is the LC version, so it doesn't have an FPU, so we again score a 1%. But the PowerPC processor scored a 77% on the processor score. I actually thought it would do a little bit better, but still, that's an incredible improvement over 4%. And the PowerPC does have an FPU, so we actually scored 120% on the floating point test. That is an extreme upgrade in performance over the stock Color Classic, and it's so cool to see. Now, one issue is that with the PowerPC card, we are stuck at the 36 megabyte RAM limit. Now, that limit felt really terrible in the LC575, but I think it's a little bit more manageable in this machine because the stock Color Classic only took 10 megabytes of RAM as a hard limit. So 36 megs of RAM is quite a dramatic improvement over that 10 megs. And then if we need even more RAM, we can just dial down into the 68040 processor. And just like that, we're back up to 132 megs of RAM for those RAM-hungry applications. Super cool. It's incredible to have this much performance and this much versatility in such a compact and frankly beautiful little machine. Okay, so I want to do one more mod today, and I understand that this one might be a bit controversial. Oh yeah, I love it. Look at that. PowerPC Color Classic. Now, this sticker probably isn't permanent because I'd like to find a smaller one, and I still want to retrobrite this thing and make it a little more presentable, but still awesome. Okay, so that'll do it for today's video. I am so excited to have this machine. Not just a Color Classic, not just a Color Classic Mystic, but a PowerPC Color Classic Mystic. I've never seen one of these. I've never heard of anyone actually having one of these things. And that upgrade for the LC575 board, it's so rare and, hard to find. It's amazing. It's the machine I've always dreamed of, honestly. Yeah, wow. And this machine is going to be a lot of fun to play vintage Mac games on both PowerPC and 68K. I mean, it's so versatile and so beautiful with this color Trinitron display. Granted, I do have to fix the geometry still. I think I'm going to just recap the whole analog board, and I already have all the caps in for it. Hopefully that'll fix the issue with the kind of bent in one side, and there is a little bit of whine coming from the CRT, which maybe that is from the analog board too. And I do have a couple other upgrades that I want to do to this thing. I want to put a blue SCSI in there, and I want to upgrade the video RAM. I have two 512K sticks made by Silicon Insider. Unfortunately, I seem to have misplaced one of them, so I'm gonna have to dig around in my boxes and see if I can find the other stick and upgrade this thing to 1 meg of VRAM. But if you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more Color Classic shenanigans like this, please subscribe down below. And thank you very much for watching. And a special thanks to B. Perkins, Camilla Noceda, Chris Allegretta, Chris Calderon, Chris Nelson, Daniel Hubbard, Greg from Rutk Mods, John Malman, Nick Hamsey, and Scott Thompson, who are my highest tiered patrons, and all of my Patreon supporters for helping to make these videos possible.